I'm really honored to be here today to give this talk on the ancestral lands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag. I'm here to tell you the story today about some of the objects that were collected from their relatives, the Anishinaabe, whose oral tradition talks about they originated here in the Northeast and then were called sometime in the past to move to a place where food grows on the water. And that food is wild rice. And that place is the Great Lakes region where I will share information about the collections. I decided to use the words life history in this title because it's been a very useful way for me to think about the history of the collections, their actual collecting, and then what I've been trying to do to engage with communities with these collections. And Bob mentioned the class that I have taught using the collections from Hopi. I won't be talking about those today, but I will be sharing with you information from that same class. Now we're working with the Anishinaabe collections. But I've also found life history as a really interesting way to help my students see the history of the collections and then engage with the different meanings that we talk about with the collections when we talk to Indigenous communities. And I decided to start with this image because last year when we were working on the Anishinaabe collections, the students who had this image kind of looked at it and was like, why is this in the collection? You know, this is a log. What's going on here? And it was really meaningful to watch them go through the semester and really see the changes in meaning on this object that was in the museum. So just a little bit about life history. When I think about life history, I usually am thinking about people's lives, or biologists use this concept to talk about differences in evolutionary trajectories, things like that. But in archaeology and museums and people who study material culture, we've been talking about the life history of objects. And I also want to put that I was very purposeful in using this term specimen in the title too, because one of the things I'll be doing is just juxtapositioning sort of scientific knowledge with indigenous wisdom throughout this talk. So just a little bit about life history because I had to show some pictures of Hopi. I wanted to put up some Hopi photos showing things about the life history of objects. I also want to point out that the titles of the photos are the titles that the photographers gave them. So I would never title something Primitive Methods, but that's what the photographer titled this image of a Hopi woman making a pot in 1903. And so this is the beginning of the life of this object. She has collected clay, she's made decisions about what to add to that clay for tempering material, and she's building the pot. And then archaeologists also think a lot about the use of objects, and here's a woman in a piki house. Piki is a traditional type of Hopi flatbread, which she's making on the stone here, but you can see the bowl here, and that has her mix in it. So we can think about life histories of how an object was created originally, how it was used, and then for archaeologists, what's been really interesting is to think about histories sort of throughout the object's life. And this is one of my favorite objects in the collections. And what you can see with this object is that it was broken, cracked, and then two mend holes were drilled in that object to tie it together with string. And this is so interesting because not every pot is mended, and it may be because that's the way they break, but clearly this is a pot that was valuable enough to mend. So there was something special about it that they chose to mend it. And then this pot, I don't know where it was found. I can tell you what area it was made in based on its clay and its painting and things like that. But the way the pot came to the museum, I don't actually know. It probably was looted from an archaeological site somewhere in Arizona, and then went through a series of museums and eventually came into private hands and then was donated to the University of Michigan. So what that shows you is how the meaning and value of objects change over time depending on the context that they're in. And so that's what I'd like to use that framework to think about the objects that are in the ethnobotanical collections that were collected from the Anishinaabe. So just to contextualize things a little bit with the collections, this is the University of Michigan Ruthven Museum building. It was built in 1928 to house research collections. And I love, they're just finishing the construction on this. For anybody that was at Michigan, you know that the Pumas went here. They weren't up yet. You can see the old cars on the side there. So within this museum building that was built for the research museums, there was paleontology, herbarium, zoology, and on the very top floor was the Museum of Anthropology, which has been renamed to the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, which is a mouthful to say. So I will use the terminology Museum of Anthropology because I'm talking about the time period when it was called the Museum of Anthropology. So when the museum was created, there was a conversation about, okay, we need to hire curators and things like that. And one of the first curators that was hired, not the very first, but one of the first, was Melvin Gilmore. And Gilmore was in his 60s when he was hired, and he had had a long career working with indigenous communities with plants. Around plants. He'd worked with groups in the Middle Missouri River area in the plains. And 5 years before he came to Michigan, he'd actually been at the Museum of the American Indian in New York, which is now the Hay Foundation, and their collections are at the National Museum of the American Indian. And when Gilmore was there, he was collecting plants, but he was also collecting objects that were made from plants. So he was hired to be the curator of ethnology at Michigan. And one of the things that I found really interesting about Gilmore was his recognition of the knowledge of indigenous people. And I just want to read you a quote from a publication that he made that's called, the publication is called Some Chippewa Uses of Plants. And it was based on field work that he did when he first got to Michigan in 1929. And he went out and started interviewing people about plants. And he's comparing the people, the indigenous people who live in Michigan with the Euro-American folks. And he said, I have found, and this is his wording, I have found that Indians usually know more about plants as living things and about their habitats and requirements. Not only do Indians know the way in which various plants serve humans, but they also have considerable knowledge about plant ecology. What Gilmore was recording is what today we would call traditional ecological knowledge in many contexts. So the other thing that starts happening when Gilmore arrives at Michigan is he starts having archaeologists send him plants. This is a time when lots of archaeologists are excavating, finding burnt things, and also finding dried plant remains in some of the caves in the Southwest and other places. So he goes to the director of the museum, Carl Gutta, and says, you know, I've been identifying these plants, but this is a great opportunity for the museum to also be the place where archaeologists can send their plant remains for identification. And Gutta says, great, let's do that. And then I think Gilmore says, and I need help. So, and the other thing that I haven't quite found out the history of, but they actually had money, I think, from Eli Lilly to help fund this lab. And so they go searching for somebody to hire on this, and they find this dapper young man, Volney Jones. And Volney has just gotten his master's degree at the University of New Mexico, and his master's thesis was on the plants of Isleta Pueblo. And one of the things that Volney says in his master's thesis is, he said, you know, I found I can interview people about plants, but if I go out into the field with them, I get much richer knowledge. So you can see how Volney and Melvin Gilmore were a good fit together. So they start collecting comparative specimens for the Museum of Anthropology, both to help identify archaeological plants, but they continue this collecting of information of living people using plants. And they put together an enormous collection of corn. We have one of the biggest collections of indigenous corn in the country. These are just the cabinets from the Southwest. And this is an example. This is the, some Hopi blue corn, and another project that I won't have time to talk about, but I can actually tell you, because of Volney's notes, I can tell you the name of the farmer that grew this corn in 1935. So, and related to my friend and colleague, Susan Sekakwaptua. So just an amazing amount of information. But the collecting's going on, they're analyzing plants that archaeologists are sending, but there seems to be some free time when Volney in particular can go out and do some projects on his own. And Volney in the 30s does 2 ethnographic projects, one with Hopi, and then the other one, which is his earlier one that I want to share with you today, is in Michigan. And so Volney gets some money, internal money, and in 1933 he says, okay, I want to go out, and the purpose is to study the indigenous knowledge of plants from Michigan. He's not using those words, of course, and also surrounding areas. So, and Volney's very interested in this technological process of using plants. So not just what's this plant, what's the indigenous name, tell me how it's used, but actually really understanding this process of how it's used. And so Volney spends the summer of 1933 going around to different communities that he has heard people in these communities are still making baskets. And he starts out here on Walpole Island, so just across Lake St. Clair there. And then he goes up to northern Michigan, where he spends, so he's coming back and forth to Walpole throughout most of June and part of July. And then he goes up to northern Michigan. And it's so interesting when he comes up here, he says, oh, not many people are actually making baskets because most of them are farming. And it's also harvest season. So he talks to a few people, but doesn't spend a whole lot of time there and isn't collecting anything. And then he goes over to Sugar Island and the Garden River area, and spends over a week there talking to people about the baskets that they're making and the mats and other things. So he's focused on general textiles. So last year I worked on the collection from Walpole Island with my class, so I want to share that with you. Next semester I'm going to be working on the Garden River collections from northern Michigan, so I will be putting those up online, and so if you would like to see them as my class develops next semester, you can. So Volney's really lucky at Walpole Island because he runs into people who are making baskets. And oh, let me just give you a little background on Walpole Island. Walpole Island today, the communities call it Bakejwanong. Ong means place in Anishinaabe, and the Bakejwan has been explained to me as the place where the waters are braided, because this is like a delta area and it's right up here. So you can see it's very close to Detroit. It wasn't a very far drive. Volney's in Ann Arbor over there on the other side, so it wasn't a very far drive for him. He was going over, spending several days, and then going back. And the communities that live on Walpole Island are a variety of different, go under a variety of different names. The Ojibwa, the Odawa, or the Potawatomi, also called the Chippewa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. But these groups, as I mentioned at the beginning, have a shared history. They all have that migration story from this area to Michigan for the same purposes. Their languages, slightly different dialects, but they overlap. Very similar worldviews, stories, shared experience. So they view themselves as three pieces of a confederacy, and think about themselves as the Three Fires Confederacy. You can see the three fires. Each fire has a slightly different purpose, but they come together to make this whole. I will not be referring to those three different groups, but using the indigenous word, which is Anishinaabe or Anishinaabek, which means the Anishinaabe people. And sometimes you'll see it with two A's at the end, sometimes you'll see it with one A at the end. It's just variation. All right, so Volney went to Walpole Island. He meets several people that are interested in talking to him about baskets, and they're actually making baskets. And the reason they're making baskets is they're getting ready for an annual fair that's held on Walpole Island. And this fair actually started in the 1890s. This is a 1926 advertisement in the Detroit Free Press, major newspaper of the fair. And it went on well into the 40s. I've been able to find newspaper articles or little advertisements like this. But what's so interesting for me about this fair is you can see how it's bringing in people with the sort of traditional stereotype of indigenous people of this time period. You have a sort of plains headdress here, tomahawk, things like that. And that was part of what was happening at these fairs. But the other thing that was happening is people were selling their crafts. So when Volney met people, they were getting ready in June and July for selling crafts at this fair. The other thing I want to point out is this is talking about a steamer, and the steamer would go from Detroit and make a special stop at Walpole Island during the days of this fair. So that suggests that lots of tourists are coming from Detroit to the Walpole Island Fair. All right, so Volney sits down with folks and starts talking to them, and I don't know what his actual entry into the community was. He may have met people at the fair the year before, but he goes over and starts talking to people, and because Volney's interested in that technological process, he starts then asking people about the whole process of making baskets. And most of the baskets that he collects are black ash baskets. And he took lots of notes, collected items, and also took a few pictures. So these pictures were up in the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan, just tucked away. They weren't even part of the museum collections. So one of the things I'm doing is reuniting the pictures with the actual objects. So here what Volney is showing is a man whose name I now know is Levi Sturgeon, and he's pounding the black ash log. And what happens when you pound the log is that the rings of the tree start separating. I got really geeked about this as an archaeologist because I love to think about tree rings, and the rings were actually separating as you pound it, but it's quite a skill. Many people have told me that you need to listen to the sound. It makes a very distinctive sound as you pound the log. So he's getting a picture of Levi Sturgeon pounding the log to pull off the strips from it, and then what happens is the strips are then thinned out, and more strips come out of the one ring of the tree's life. And Levi Sturgeon has built himself a sort of special horse for smoothing out the strips. So then he and his wife Winnie can start making baskets. And you can see what she's doing is after he split those strips of wood, she's then thinning them out with a knife and cutting the edges, and then he's weaving the basket here. So this is life history. This is the beginning of the life of this basket right here that Levi Sturgeon is making. And one of the things that's interesting is Volney, well, you'll see in his notes that Levi Sturgeon said he's agreed to make the whole process of the basket, and then Volney collected many of these baskets. So that's the next picture I have to show you. So Volney was interested in sort of all these stages of the basket making. So he collected herbarium sheets. This is a herbarium sheet of black ash. He collected that log. So now you can see it's partially pounded and the strips have started to come off. Now this log is really interesting from the notes too, because he says, well, Levi Sturgeon sold me this log because it's got some problems with it. He didn't like it. It's not big enough. They didn't take all the bark off of it. He says it's got knots in it, so it's just, so he did the partial pounding, but then was like, no, okay, you want this log, I'll sell it to you. And then he also collected lots of the strips at various stages. Some of them are dyed, some of them are really thin, lots and lots of the strips for the baskets. And then he also collected the frames that were used in the baskets, and then this is a finished basket that he got to watch basically the whole production of. And Levi Sturgeon says to him, oh, I'll make you a different type of basket that not many people are making. And this often is called, in Volney's notes, it's called a melon basket, because if you imagine going to the market, it would be a nice basket for holding a melon. Okay. The other thing that Volney did that's just a delight is he took tons and tons of notes, and he often drew things about the process of manufacture. So this is actually July 7th, he's interviewing Levi Sturgeon. There's another man's name up there who's actually the husband of one of the other basket makers, and he says, Mr. and Mrs. Sturgeon have agreed to make a basket, and this is what he uses to thin out those strips. And he made it himself. He learned it from his dad. And then I love that Volney's got all the different pieces that in his field notes. And the other thing that I really think is wonderful about Volney Jones is this quote, which he actually put in his report, where he says, you know what? I try to do this every once in a while. I actually try to use the techniques. And that way I can see how easy or difficult it is. And then this is my favorite part of this quote. Incidentally, an appreciation of the art is also gained from doing this. But isn't this amazing that this man in his late 20s is sitting down and talking to people about the baskets that they're making and trying it out, to try to see how difficult or hard things are, and watching that whole process. So the other thing that Volney's doing is collecting information clearly about the basket makers, and he recognizes that people are related to each other, and he puts a little bit of that information in his notes. But it was something that I was intrigued with, and one of the students in my class last year was a historian, and she said, oh, I'd love to do genealogical research. So together we worked on some of the relationships that Volney kind of tangentially mentioned and gave us enough clues. So this picture right here, this woman in the white dress is a woman who Volney calls Mrs. Hyman Smith, because this is the 1930s, and this is a woman who's older than he is, and so. But we wondered, sort of what's her first name and things like that, and we were able to identify her as Ada Aquash Smith. Aquash is her maiden name, by doing some looking around and putting clues together. And what you see is Ada is holding a basket that's actually pretty unusual for the type of baskets that are made on Walpole Island. And that basket was actually made by her daughter. Volney got information about it, and he also collected those two baskets, so they are part of the collection. Mrs. Smith tells him that she learned that by observing an old basket that was in one of their neighbors' barns, and then she figured out how to do the weave. Mrs. Smith also talks about one of her older sisters and how she has some knowledge about making baskets and using plants that Mrs. Smith doesn't quite remember. And so this picture is actually Ada with her sister Sarah, whose Sarah's maiden name is Shogunash. And this name, there's still people on Walpole Island today with this last name. And also Aquash is one of the other names that is still on Walpole Island too. And what Sarah's pointing at is actually a reed mat that is, the top part is woven together with a type of wood fiber, basswood fiber, and that's what Ada has around her waist, is she has actually made the fibers for Volney, and then they've shown him how they start these mats, and then the mat would have just been sort of a flat weave going through those. But the other exciting thing is Volney collected the mat. So we have the mat, we have the fibers, we have lots of different information from this project. And this picture just really started to pull all this together. We actually have some of these rushes too that were boiled at various points, and of course Volney's like, these were boiled for 5 minutes, and these were boiled for 15 minutes, and these, because he's so interested in that technological part of things. Now, for those of you from anthropology, you also know that the 1930s is a time period that lots of anthropologists are out talking to indigenous communities. This is a time period where people often refer to this as salvage anthropology, where people are going out and trying to collect as much traditional knowledge as possible before it's perceived that that knowledge is going to disappear. And you could argue that Volney falls into that tradition. In fact, Ada, at one point in the notes, sort of says to Volney, yeah, I'm 75. And he writes in his notes, she doesn't look older than 60. And then there's a little note that says, her husband says she's 58. So clearly she was kind of poking fun at him a little bit by him wanting to get all this traditional knowledge. But I would argue that Volney was also acknowledging that we want the traditional knowledge, but that doesn't exclude other things. And you can see this in his collecting. He actually was collecting tourist items for the fair at Walpole Island. This is a little paddle that is very typical of some of the things that were sold at the fair. He also collected information on traditional dyes, which most people were not using at the time, but also the commercial dyes that they were using. So this is from the Bentley Library. This is, you can't really see it, but this is Volney's writing on this, that he collected the information on the dyes. And then he collected this corn husk mat, which Sarah Shogunash, who was in the previous picture, said, oh, let me show you this mat that I made. It actually won first prize at the fair last year. And then Volney buys this one and then a hickory mat from her too. But you can see the chemical dyes in there. So he was acknowledging that this traditional knowledge is still being used, and being used in a way that's then at the Walpole Island Fair. All right, so Volney makes these collections. He uses them some in teaching, but what happened at Michigan is the lab of ethnobotany really turns into the comparative plant place. And so these items, which were ethnographic, or are ethnographic items, were stored in a different place in the museum. Volney's field notes are in the accessions records, and much of his personal correspondence and some notes about the project and then some things about the project are up at the Bentley Historical Library, which collects the University of Michigan history. It's all over the place. So what I want to turn to now is the new life, the next life of these collections. and tell you about some projects that I've been involved with, but also a project that my friend and colleague Carla Sinopoli was involved with before she left Michigan to go to the University of New Mexico Maxwell Museum. So one of the things that I've been doing with my classes is creating an online catalog of some of the collections. And there is a QR code, which I don't know if from far away you can scan it, but it'll take you to the online collection. And what we do in this is just put up the museum information, a little bit of information from the field notes, also some of the descriptive things of the field notes. It's organized in sort of classic library fashion because it's using the online platform Omeka. But what I found is so nice about these doing things digitally is I can recreate the relationships between the information in the collections. So I can say, okay, here's a basket that Levi Sturgeon made, and here's some strips that he made, and here's the dyes that they use, and here's the picture of the tools that they use. And even though they're scattered in the museum, it starts to put them back in their cultural context. And the reason we create these catalogs for this class is because then the students have the opportunity to video conference with the communities from which these objects originated. So last year, the students got to video conference with people on Walpole Island. And it's not a very far drive from Ann Arbor, but the coordinating getting 23 students together with basket makers from Walpole Island is just hard. And so I haven't been able to do that with the class. But I've also really started to play around with this idea about, is that okay? Because community members are in their comfortable environment, and my students are in their comfortable environment, and the community members are the teachers during those class periods. And so there's all this educational things that get talked about. What happened when we were talking to Walpole Island, I never know how the conversations are going to go. And it really went into talking about natural resources and what's endangered at Walpole Island, and how they are losing. Many people on Walpole Island aren't making baskets anymore, but it was so interesting to see the history of these baskets. There's some mystery objects in the collections that Volney made that nobody could figure out. And we had some conversations about that, but it often ends up being not so much about the objects, but about these sort of broader life lessons. So it's interesting to think about people being in their safe places to talk about those things, rather than what usually happens is when museums have community members come in, you're in that museum space, and it feels like a warehouse, and the objects feel like they're stored, which is what we're doing in museums. So that's the digital project, and as part of doing the research last year for this project, there was another project going on at the same time, which was a basket exhibit at the Saginaw Chippewa Tribal Museum, which is called the Zebouing Center. And this exhibit opened at the end of the semester, and through the class, I was able to contribute a little content to the exhibit, but I want to give you a little bit of the backstory of the exhibit. The exhibit started with a conversation between Carla Sinopoli, and if you know Carla, she loves red, and this is at the opening, and she's just been given a red strawberry basket by the community members, so this is why she's making this lovely face, and I'm sorry this isn't clearer. And then with Shannon Martin. And this conversation happened when Carla was the director of the Museum of Anthropology, and Shannon is the director of the Zebouing Center, and they were at a NAGPRA consultation. And the consultation, I think, was going kind of slow, or it was done, and Carla was like, oh, do you guys want to see anything else in the collections? We have a big basket collection. And Shannon went into the basket collection. She's like, oh, I know the person who made that basket. And oh, I've never seen this style of baskets, like those open weave baskets. Nobody makes those. let's put together an exhibit. And they talked about it for a while, and then they finally got together, and Shannon came down for another project that I was involved with. And they said, okay, let's do this. And they picked baskets for the exhibit. And I don't know how many baskets they picked, there were a lot of them. And one of my contributions was just to share some of those photos. But this is at the opening exhibit. So Carla's gotten her strawberry basket, and then Shannon has just presented the now director of the museum, Mike Gallaty, with a basket that was made by these two people, Sarah and Josh Hominga. And my hope is that I get some grant money this coming semester so I can bring Josh and Sarah actually down to talk to my class about the project, the collections that we'll be working on this semester. So this is at the Zebewing Center. The exhibit's right behind that door, so this was kind of like the ribbon cutting for it. And the other thing I want to show you is the introductory panel, and I don't expect you to read this, but I want you to see, and I'm not going to try to butcher the Anishinaabe one, but that translates, the title of the exhibit translates to, they work with each other. And it had a double meaning, because this first part is talking about how materials, like the plants, and people work together to create these amazing baskets. But then the other part of this talks about how the museums were working together, and how this started out of the discussions of NAGPRA, and how this is sort of what everybody hopes the beyond NAGPRA world looks like. So one of the things with the exhibit that was interesting is the dialogue was really Carla saying, okay, what do you want? Here's the collections, picking collections together, but then the community was like, we just want to keep it really simple. So there was this introductory panel, and then there were 9 cases that just showed the baskets, because I think they really wanted the baskets to speak for themselves, and in this lovely space. And so the cards are just the regular, you know, who made this, where's it from, when was it collected, that sort of thing. And you can actually see, here's the market basket that I showed you before is right there. And then these are the baskets that were in the picture, the open weave baskets. And then I did just a tiny bit of text to go with the pictures based on the research that we had done on the collections. And what you can't see here is this is a photo of one of Volney Jones's field notes that I was just, he did such a nice drawing, and so I wanted to include it in the collection to kind of show this process of an anthropologist and the work he was doing. And at the exhibit, Sarah Hominga goes up there and says, look, you can figure out how they're weaving this. She's got her hands on Volney's notes saying, this is how this weave was done, and she's standing there talking to Josh, and then anybody who would come up and said, can you figure out how they did that weave? Look at this. And for me, again, this is another place where not only the objects got a new life, but also Volney's field notes got a new life that way too. And his careful drawing of that weave could help then the basket makers think about how to make that weave. And Sarah and Josh told me that they were interested in trying to make that weave, but I haven't seen them do it yet, and I hope when they come to visit we can have that conversation again. All right, so many of you have been in collections with Indigenous community members, and you also know that it's that space where sometimes you have to face that, okay, here's the science that the archaeologists and the anthropologists have been doing, and then here's the Indigenous perspective. And so I want to just spend a little bit of time thinking about that now. And I really thought about this for a project where we had a bunch of community members come in, we'd gotten a university grant, and so we had a dean come and do the welcoming, and she was welcoming the community in and talking about the museum space and things like that. And she kept using the word specimen in her conversation because she was in the Natural History Museum context, and you know, there's dinosaurs and there's zoology and the plants and everything else. And one of the community members looked at her and said, why do you keep calling them specimens? And for me, I don't think she realized what was happening, but what was happening in that context is the acknowledgement that the objects that are in the museums have had a much deeper life history than just the objects themselves. And this really became clear to me with my class when we were learning from community members about the black ash baskets. Because what Volney didn't get to do, because he wasn't there at the right time, was he didn't get to go collect the logs for the baskets. And I think had he been able to go out in the swamps and be with the black ash and be with people, he would have still been in there as a botanist, but he would have gotten a slightly different appreciation of the actual process of selecting the logs, because community members are very careful about which trees they decide to chop down to then use to make the black ash baskets. And part of it's how well it would work for the basket, and I bet that's what Volney would have recorded when he was out there. But this quote by one of the pigeon family from a video that was made really epitomizes this thoughtfulness about the trees. And he says, I think he'd, and he's referring to the tree, enjoy living the rest of his life at our house or on somebody's shelf as a basket. So what you can see is this idea of the baskets have their life and they're made, but the life starts as a living tree and continues on in the baskets. And this is another thing that's when the pounding's happening, and I don't think Volney was involved in much of the pounding, but literally you can see the years of the tree's life splitting apart. And the basket makers are often talking about that as they're pounding the logs. Clearly, Volney also recognized that the making the baskets was a family tradition. He took that picture, he did some recording of the knowledge that different family members knew and who was making baskets. But I don't think he also realized how essential it was to family members. And this is a quote that Judy Pamp sent to me. She's the associate director of the Zebuing Center and comes from a black ash making family, that she sent to me when we were talking about her coming to video conference with my class. And what you can see in this quote is how important the process of making black ash baskets is for carrying on that traditional knowledge, and how it happens in that family setting where everybody's working together to make a basket. Some people might be pounding, some people might be cutting the strips, some people might be dyeing the strips, some people might be weaving the baskets, but everybody comes together to weave the baskets and to weave that knowledge together. And so thinking about this sort of broader meaning and life history in the terms of the life history, thinking about where Volney's scientific knowledge comes into play, and amazing that he recorded it, but then there's this whole indigenous knowledge that Volney either wasn't hearing, or it wasn't being shared with him, or he just wasn't potentially interested. But this is what's so nice about working with the baskets today, is because community members are sharing out this knowledge with my students. And actually I was at a basket making workshop, and a lot of this sort of same knowledge gets passed on. And this is actually really important in this world that we live in, because Anishinaabe communities are really worried about these traditions in the 21st century. Because I think you've got emerald ash borer here. Yeah, and so this is the beetle, and what it does is the larvae burrow under the bark and literally kill the tree from the outside in by killing off those growth layers. And these are all the areas where black ash has been, in the Ann Arbor area, I think almost all the ash is gone. And so how, Judy Pamp said to us, how do you continue all this learning that happens when we're making baskets as the materials are getting more and more scarce. And one of the things that Judy has started doing is she doesn't make baskets anymore to sell. She only makes baskets in educational contexts where she can start, where she can make sure that knowledge is being passed down. Now, one of the things that is interesting is there's a small proportion of black ash that are resistant to the emerald ash borer. And I know there's a study going on in Pennsylvania starting to try to understand why those trees are resistant. And some of the Anishinaabe basket makers that I've talked to, you can see up in northern Michigan, it's not quite as prevalent. And they think part of that is because of the colder winters there, the beetles aren't as prevalent. But there are people even in lower Michigan that have said their trees are still standing. So I'm hopeful that the indigenous communities are helping to promote those trees and the life of those trees so that all the black ash won't be lost. The irony of the emerald ash borer is it actually started in the Detroit area. It looks, one of the first places that it was recorded decimating the populations was actually on Walpole Island. And most of the black ash is gone on Walpole Island. Okay, I just want to take just a few more minutes and tell you about another project because I don't want to end on this sad note. And so what I want to do now is turn to something else that Volney collected on Walpole Island, and that's corn. And he collected this from George Shoganash, who's Sarah is his wife, who was making the mats. And this is a type of white flint corn that George Shoganash was growing. And Volney said, yeah, it looks like an old variety and not many people are growing it on the island anymore. And so he was collecting it in part because Michigan was collecting all those diversity of corn, but you know, for the comparative collections. But it's sort of sat in our collection since 1933. Volney did, in the summer of 1935, actually plant some of this corn, and that's why it's off of there. It grew in Ann Arbor. He was growing actually corn from their collections from all over. So we actually have the daughter corn in our collection too, from 1935, but it's just sat in the collection. And again, growing out of a NAGPRA consultation, community members were in and they were sort of talking to our NAGPRA staff, and it was like, hey, we know about the baskets, what else do you have in the collection? And they said, well, you know, we have this big corn collection. And they started pulling up. We don't have much corn from Michigan, but we have about 5 different collections. They got really excited about it. And so asked if we could come together and think about the corn. And they asked me to do the sort of research on the history of the collections, and then asked the curator from the Botanical Gardens, David Michener, to be part of the conversation too. And we brought community members together and talked about a lot of different ideas, but one of the things that kept coming up was we want to grow this corn. We need to grow this corn. Nobody's growing this variety anymore, so we need to try this. Plus, we want to know more about the collections, we want to share it with our communities, that sort of thing, which I'm doing with the class. But so in the summer of 2018, the Botanical Gardens identified a small garden in between the greenhouses where we could start preparing to grow this corn. And this has been a slow, thoughtful process because it's complicated, but really I think shows where we can go next. And I really like to think about this as regenerative collaboration. Just like many farmers are talking about regenerative agriculture, where you're building up the soils. This is thinking about collaborations that could grow out potentially this corn. But it's been a slow process. So here's the planting that happened in 2018. It's happened again in 2019. But what we realized in this process is there's lots of things that have to come together. There has to be a memorandum with the University of Michigan about the use of the space and what will happen with the seeds that are grown here, and an agreement with a variety of different communities. When we plant out the museum seeds, it'll be with the individual community where that seed was collected from, but we wanted a sort of general framework of an agreement of how will everybody work together. And I'm not in charge of that agreement, but what I understand is that anything that's grown in this space will be the daughters of what's grown, the seeds that are grown in this space are then not the universities, even though the university provided the space and helped to tend them, but they go to the communities. There's just no question about that. So that is all still working through, but the communities wanted to get going on it. And so part of what we needed to do was show that this space was going to work to grow seeds. And so in 2018 and just in 2019, the harvest was just the Harvest Festival was just a few weeks ago, that community members have been bringing in their heritage seeds. So these are from seed libraries that are in communities, or from farmers that just wanted to start sharing out their seeds. And we've had very, very, very successful harvests from this very small place. And we've grown corn and some Potawatomi watermelon that's red seeded in stores for a long time. Squash, sunflowers, and tobacco have grown in this space. And what happens is community members come together and the students are there planting. It's tended by the university and then harvested, and we have a feast to celebrate the harvest at the end, which people are invited to. We planted this corn in 2018. It's a big kerneled white corn. And in this context, again, we get to think about the life of the objects and where they can, the objects can, the specimens, as the dean was talking about them, how they can move on and be thinking about going back to communities to be helping with those issues of food sovereignty and thinking about health and traditions. But one of the things I've also learned from this project is many times if the knowledge of how to grow traditional crops, if that knowledge is waning in the community, there needs to be support for communities. And the museum and those of us academics cannot provide that support. But one of the amazing things that's happening is there's Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, who Elizabeth Hoover, who's here at Brown, is very much involved with. And that organization is really providing the knowledge and support for communities as their traditional crops come back into the communities. And once again, this is important for us to think about, because we're laying the foundation for growing out the museum seeds, that the garden is working, and once all the paperwork gets done, we can start thinking about how to grow out the museum seeds. And the reason it's important is because the seeds are really seen as relatives and nurturing for those communities. So to end, I just want to say miigwech, which is the Anishinaabe way of saying thank you. Thank you to Bob and Leah for inviting me. Thank you to the museum and the funding that helped bring me here. And I have really appreciated this opportunity to reflect on what I've been doing, because it's all been about doing and not thinking about so much the larger context, but there's so many important messages in this larger context. I also wanted to acknowledge Volney Jones and all those people who talked to him, because such a rich collection and so wonderful to be able to build on what he started to try to have these very deep and rich conversations with the community members. And also finally the students in my museum anthro class, because they push me all the time to think about these new ways of teaching them about life history and the complex journeys that these objects have been on. So thank you very much.